we've talked before about the fact that when you walk through a storm, or if you walk out in the neighborhood after there's been a storm. We had an ice storm recently in Dallas, Texas. I had no idea that Dallas, Texas even knew where ice was apart from in the refrigerator. But we had a very bad ice storm, and it was interesting. As the ice began to melt, I realized the damage it had actually done. A lot of our trees, you know, huge branches were gone. So storms alter the landscape, and it's the same with us. When you walk through a dark season in your life, it will alter the landscape of your heart. I want to talk in this session about the impact of shame on a woman's life. I grew up in a land of castles. Do you know there's over 3,000 castles in Scotland? Some date back to the 11th and 12th centuries. But when I was a young girl, my very favorite castle was close to where we lived. And in the summertime, my mom and my sister and my brother and I and some of our family friends, we would drive to Loch Doon Castle. And the thing I loved about it was a partially ruined castle. And so you could go in and explore. And it was by the edge of a lake. But if you got to the top of the castle, you actually looked out across the ocean. And I worked out something that my sister could not do. My sister's kind of what every mother prays for. She's the well-behaved one. She's the one that liked to wear all the sticky, outy dresses, you know, and the ribbons. And I was very much a tomboy. And what I discovered was one of the parts of the castle that was still intact was the giant chimney. And I could get inside, and I put my back against one wall and my feet against, I could climb the whole way up the chimney and come out on the top of the castle. Oh, I just banged my ring in case you wondered what that noise was at home. It was amazing. And I would sit up there on the turret and I would survey my land. You know, I could see my family down there, little minions, my servants, and I could see right across the ocean. And up there, I felt like a princess. I really did. But not like one of those Disney princesses. I felt like a warrior princess. And I would defend my people against any foes. But after a while, my sister Frances would come to the bottom of the chimney and shout out, "Sheila, get down. If Mum sees where you are, you will be in trouble." And so I had to come back down and enter a land where I was no longer a princess. Back to a place where what I honestly experienced more than anything else was a deep, pervading sense of shame. If you asked me to describe shame, I would describe it this way. To me, guilt tells you you've done something wrong. Shame tells you you are something wrong. You know, if you've done something wrong, if I've said something unkind to my husband or done something that I can repair, I can go to the person and say, "Please forgive me. I'm so sorry." But if you feel you are something wrong, what do you do with that? I love the way that writer Edward Welsh describes it. He says, shame is a squatter that refuses to leave. I was asked a couple of years ago to speak at an annual gathering of ministry leaders in the States. On that particular year, it was being held in my home of Dallas, Texas. And they asked if I would come and speak to all the women in an afternoon session. And I knew that these were seasoned women. They weren't just new believers. Many of them I knew and loved and respected. And so at my session, what I did was, before the women came in, I got a little 3x5 card and a pencil, and I put it on every chair. And I prayed over every chair that the Lord would meet each woman exactly in the place where she needed to hear him. So I spoke about telling the truth. Why is that such a strange thing for us as believers? Like we feel obliged to say the right thing as opposed to say what we're actually feeling. I mean, have you ever had that? You're driving to church and you've just had some terrible argument with your husband in the car. You have called him things that are not in the New Testament. They may be in the Old, but they're not in the New. And then you get to church, and the guy at the door says, "Good morning, how are you?" And you're like, "Oh, I'm so close to Jesus, I'm nearly flying." But so often we just, instead of saying, "You know what, I'm not doing good today. I'm not doing good at all," we don't want to do that. So what I did was, I just said to the women, "Look, I don't want you to write your name on the card, but here's my question for you." And it's my question for you and for those watching at home. If when you walked into the studio today, or when you showed up in your home, suddenly all your baggage became visible. I don't mean your snacks and your purse and your pillow. I mean your stuff. The stuff that weighs you down inside. You know, the anger, the unforgiveness, the disappointment, the bitterness. the heartache, the insecurity, all the things. What would that look like if you had to drag it from where you came into your seat? I think some of us would be horrified by how much we're carrying. Some of us might be heartbroken by how long we've carried it for. But my question to the women that day was, if you saw it, would you want to take it home? Or would you want to take Christ up on that ridiculously glorious offer of this divine exchange where he says, come unto me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, because my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So I said to these girls, what I'd like you to do is if there's something that you just do not want to take home anymore, I want you to write it down on the card. And I had a simple wooden cross at the front, and I said, why don't you simply come and lay that card at the foot of the cross? And I said, I promise I'll take it home and I'll pray over every single one. I prayed over every single one with tears rolling down my face that day because of what was written on the cards. These were not beginner believers. These are seasoned women. And some of the things were shame because of the abortion, never told my husband. Shame because of the affair. Shame because of the addiction to prescription medication or alcohol. Serious things. Shame because I never told my son I loved him and then he died. I found myself sobbing, praying for these women. And honestly, it's the reason that I wrote the book, because I thought, Lord, you do not want your daughters to live like that. I love the way the Message puts that text that you find at the end of Matthew 11. Here's what it says. Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Get away with me and you'll recover your life. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. The first time that we ever see the word shame is in the book of Genesis. You remember? At the end of Genesis, there's a statement that I just do not relate to. It says, Adam and Eve were naked and they were not ashamed. I've not known that feeling since I was 18 months old. But then you have that terrible moment where the enemy tests Eve and she reaches out and grabs fruit from the tree of life, and suddenly her eyes are opened. And she feels such shame, so that when God comes walking in the garden in the cool of the day, Adam and Eve do what you and I have been doing ever since. They hide. They get behind a tree. They get behind the very thing that God gave them to enjoy. And God says, where are you? Adam says, we're naked and we're shamed. And God says, who told you that? It's the first, you're about to see the first act of grace there in the garden. I always thought that when God put Adam and Eve out of the garden, it was an act of judgment. And part of it was that. But if you read Genesis 3, you'll read what the real act of grace is, because it says, God said, if we let them stay, they will eat of the tree of life and they will live forever broken. God said, no, I love you far too much to let you live forever broken. And so we see the first foreshadowing of Christ as God slaughters an animal and makes clothes for Adam and Eve. I wonder if that serpent noticed the little drops of blood leading out of the garden. I wonder if he realized that the first note in his devastation and destruction was sounded right there at the place where he thought he won a victory. You see all the way through the Old Testament. Remember when Moses is getting the children of Israel out of Egypt, put the blood on the doorpost, a sign of the Lamb that was to come. And then we read of Christ himself, he who knew no shame, who became shame for us. I imagine the enemy standing at the foot of the cross, somewhere in the crowd, thinking to himself, he's finished. He missed the whole point, because Jesus was about to cry out, it is finished. And you can write across your life, bill paid in full. He has paid for everything so that you and I can live free of the shame. It says in Colossians 2:14 and 15, I love this. He, Christ, canceled the record of the charges against us and took it away by nailing it to the cross. In this way, he disarmed the spiritual rulers and authorities. He shamed them publicly by his victory over them on the cross. The enemy only has the power to shame us if we give it to him. So here's a few quick suggestions. Number one, put your shame into words. Write it down. Ask God to give you eyes to know where there's still dark areas in the cellar of your soul. Write it down. Number two, turn to your rescuer. When I was a student in seminary in London, I drove one day to the very end, the very last point in England. And if you stand there and you look out, all you look out on is nothing, just this grey, grey ocean. It can look like so despairing unless you turn around. And if you turn around, all of England lies before you. So I want to say to you, turn away from all the despair and the shame. Turn around and see the one who's your deliverer. Number three, get to know Jesus. The antidote to shame is the love of Christ. Do you know that you have never lived an unloved moment in your life? Doesn't always feel that way, but that is the truth. That God knows your whole story and he loves you. And number four, finally, associate your identity with Christ. When my son was traveling with me when he was probably, 4 years old, he had been back at the hotel with his grandma, and they were coming over to the arena where I was speaking that night, but his grandma had forgotten their backstage passes. And so when they tried to get in, the security man was questioning them that they should not be there. And I happened to be walking backstage, and Christian saw me, and he yelled out, "I'm with her!" Anytime that you feel the enemy bringing that condemnation, you just cry out in victory, "I'm with him." And if the enemy tries to remind you of your past, remind him of his future. He's a defeated foe, and we are more than conquerors in Christ Jesus our Lord. Amen.